You're listening to the Daily Mishnah Podcast with Benedict.
We're engaged in questions of how the get is written, in particular what we do when Hebrew and Greek are mixed up. And of course, the general principle that we're always going to follow is that the get is valid if the intention is clear. So whether it's written in Greek or in Hebrew, as long as the intention is clear, the get's going to be valid. But the Mishnah is then going to examine the question of what if the intention was imposed by a court. So we'll see that if the intention is clear, that from a linguistic point of view, it's valid. But what if the person, the man, the husband who gave this get did not want to give the get? And we'll get into that issue at the end of this Mishnah, and we'll look at Maimonides, who discusses the question at some length in his Mishneh Torah. But let's begin with the linguistic issues. Get shekatavo ivrit ve'edav yevanim. A get that was written in Hebrew, but the signatures are in Greek. Yevanim ve'edim ivrim. Maybe it was written in Greek, but the signature is in Hebrew. Or ed echad ivri ve'ed echad yevani. Maybe one signatory signed in Hebrew and one in Greek. Ed echad yevani ve'ed echad ivri, the other way around. And it's kasher. It's valid. It works. It works. Because the principle is that it's recognizable. Katav hasofer ve'ed kasher. So if it's written by a scribe and he was a witness, it's kasher. The scribe can be a witness. If it says ish ploni ed, it's kasher. If it says so and so and he was the witness, in other words, it doesn't say his father's name, it just says his name, but it's valid. Ben ish ploni ed, son of so and so, he's the witness, and it's kasher. Remember that the purpose of the witnesses are just in order to validate the get in case of a query. It's tikkun olam. So as long as we can identify the witnesses, we're going to be okay. Ish ploni, ben ish ploni, velo chatav ed, kasher. If he wrote so-and-so, son of so-and-so, and he didn't write the word witness, it's kasher. But it's clear if he signed the get, he's clearly the witness. We don't need to write out the word witness on the get. Katav chanichato v'chanichata. If he wrote his family name and hers, or maybe this means his nickname and hers. It's not quite clear, but we'll see and the commentators differ, but we'll see from the context, it looks like his family name and hers. Katav chanichato v'chanichata. Kasher. He writes out the two family names or the two nicknames, it's kasher. The reason I think it's the family names is that the Mishnah goes on to say, Kach hayu v'kiyei hadat shebirushalayim kovim. Thus, the scrupulous people or the experts in Jerusalem would do. So I presume in this case, it's the family names. So in all these cases, the get works. But now let's have a look at a get that doesn't work. A get mu'useh, a get which is imposed. Somebody forces you to write the get. And of course, the get has to be given willingly. So the Mishnah says, B'Yisrael kasher u'v'goyim pasor. If a Jewish court forces, it's kasher. And if a Gentile court wants to force, it's not going to be kasher. There seems to be a distinction between Jewish and non-Jewish. In other words, if the Gentiles beat him up and say, look, we forced you to divorce your wife, that is not considered a kosher divorce. If a Jewish court says you have to divorce her, and we've learned, for example, if he doesn't maintain his wife for a month, he has to give her a divorce. There's no option. So there are situations If a man doesn't fulfill his obligations under the ketubah, he has to divorce his wife. And the Jewish court will make him do that. But somehow we don't trust a Gentile court unless it seems it's under the direction of a Jewish court. And so the Mishnah continues. V'hagoyim chovtim oto ve'omrim lo aseh ma sheYisrael omrim la. And if Gentiles beat him and say to him, do what the Israelites say to you, okay, and that our Kaufman manuscript stops at that point. Our Kaufman manuscript stops, but most other editions of the Mishnah go on to say ve'chasher, and it is valid. So I put this in the source sheet in square brackets. And that is effectively the halacha, which the Mishneh Torah is going to explain, and we'll see the Mishneh Torah, second chapter. Someone who the law requires to be compelled to divorce his wife, but doesn't want to divorce her. So he has to do it, and he doesn't want it. Beit Din shel Yisrael b'chol makom v'chol zman makin oto ad sheyomar rotzeh ani. So a Jewish court in any place and at any time should beat him until he says, I want to. So the get has to be given willingly. So they beat him until they say, oh yes, I'm willing to give the get. That's how we make sure the get is kasher. And the Rambam goes on to say, V'yichtov haget v'hu get kasher, and he'll write a get, and this get is kasher. So it's kasher if they beat him up to the extent that he says, "Oh yes, I want to give the get." And the Rambam goes on, V'chein im hikuhu akum. Similarly, if Gentiles beat him, so if Gentiles beat him, ve'amru lo aseh ma sheYisrael omrim la, and said, look, do what the Gentiles, or do what the Israelites tell you. Yisrael biyat hakum. And so the Jews pressure him via the Gentiles. Ad shigaresh, until he divorces his wife. Harei ze kasher. It's a kosher get. If the Jews employ the Gentile courts to put on pressure, that is a kosher get. And we've seen this most recently in the UK, where withholding a get is seen as coercive control, it's seen as domestic abuse. And on those grounds, an English court would threaten prison unless the man in question gives a get. And usually in these situations, the man will just give a get. He doesn't want to go to prison for not giving a get. But if the Gentiles if they compel him of their own initiative, and if the Gentiles compel him to write on their own initiative, the get is invalid because he's being compelled against his will. And then the Rambam goes on to explain that, the concept of being compelled against one's will only applies that the problem with, if you like, a get that's invalid because someone doesn't want to give it, is only when a person is doing something that Torah doesn't obligate him to do. But when the Torah does obligate him to divorce his wife, it's only his evil inclination, Maimonides says, which is holding him back. And so the beating by the court, whether it's a Jewish court or whether it's a Gentile court on behalf of a Jewish court, this beating up is just getting him to do what he wanted to do originally, effectively what his pure soul wanted him to do in any case. And so the get is valid. And we do wonder, reading these halachot, why modern courts don't make more use of these powers.
Thank you for listening to this edition of the Daily Mishnah Podcast with Benedict.